My name is Emily Akkermans, I am Curator of Time and I work here at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. Thousands of visitors come here from all across the world to visit what is known as a historic prime meridian. People love having their picture taken outside in the courtyard on the line, but it's actually this telescope behind me that was very important. This is a telescope with which the clock stars were observed, and it's from this telescope that the clocks were corrected to accurate time. So this is actually at the heart of the time system of Greenwich. So time has always been very important to the astronomers and their assistants working at the observatory. Astronomers observe the stars, as you might know, and they need to know their positions, and they used clocks to determine their positions very accurately. So astronomers did two things. They used clocks to measure the stars, but they also used the stars to measure time. So the role that time plays in people's lives has changed a lot, and time, accurate time, as we now all have access to, was very different in the past. So in the 17th, 18th and 19th century, very accurate time was really only important for astronomers working at observatories or navigators trying to find their way at sea. For other people, ordinary people living their daily lives, time didn't have to be very accurate. So there are many different ways of indicating time for communities to gather. You could have the bell ringing to start the market, or the bell ringing at midday. You might have a sundial centre in the centre of your town that people could consult. Some people might have clocks. They would have been regulated to the sundials. But increasingly, as clocks became more common, it became more apparent that time differences could cause confusion. So before the standardisation of time throughout the UK, time had to be determined via the stars using telescopes, and then you had to physically transport that time to where you wanted to regulate other timepieces. So for example, navigators who needed accurate time for navigation for their portable clocks, chronometers on board their ships, would have to travel down to the Thames, and then at 1 o'clock they could watch the time board drop daily from the roof of Flamstead House. That would give them the accurate time at exactly 1 o'clock every single day. The railways were connected to the Greenwich time system, but not every household or not everybody was, so there were other ways to get accurate time, and this was by means of time balls that were shown in shop windows. There was a time ball on the Strand that would show the public in London what the time was. It would drop exactly at a pre-announced time each day. There was also a time ball in Deal. This was used for shipping, and that was connected directly to Greenwich. From 1833, navigators, sailors and captains on the Thames could look up to the Royal Observatory at exactly 1 p.m. and watch the ball drop for an accurate time signal. Another way people got accurate time was via the Belleville time service. John Belleville was an assistant at the Royal Observatory, and he started a time service. What he did was he had an accurate chronometer. He had it checked by the observatory timepieces to see it was accurate, and then he physically travelled into London and sold the time to chronometer makers who also needed accurate time. Before the standardisation of time, people had to physically carry a timepiece they knew was accurate to then set any clock they wanted to show the same time as that, and they would have to use this portable timekeeper to set any clock to show the same time. You can imagine that's quite challenging. With a watch similar to this one, the Belleville family, consisting of Father John, wife Maria and daughter Ruth, would transport the time into London, physically carrying the chronometer rated at the observatory. The sun is very important in our daily lives and for our timekeeping. We all know that the rise of the sun, apparently in the east, and its setting in the west indicates the amount of daylight hours we have, with noon being the important middle part of the day. In the past, before we shared time more widely, everyone would live to their local sun. But this means that there is a slight difference in time depending on where you live. And the further east or west you are from each other, the bigger this time difference is. So the Earth spins 360 degrees in 24 hours. So each hour is 15 degrees difference in longitude, and that is the basis for our time zone system today in theory. If you keep time according to the sun, and the sun appears to rise in the east, set in the west, that means that if it rises in the east around London, it does take a while for the sun to rise as the Earth is rotating. Further west you go. So this results in a time difference. In Great Britain, in England, the difference is, at its most, about 30 minutes. But if you look to a country that has a larger east-west division, such as Russia or the United States, that time difference becomes massive and problematic. A country like Chile, which is very long from north to south, but very small east to west, doesn't have such a huge difference in time because it's on the same line of longitude. So for every 15 degrees we spin, that's 1 hour time difference. 180 degrees is a 12-hour time difference. So in theory, the theoretical idea of time zones is the whole world is divided into 24 sections with an hour's division each. Yes, it doesn't work in reality because of geography. Countries want to keep the time zone. They might fall outside of that region. They might want to align with other countries because they trade a lot with them. So it's very complicated to put that theory into practice. But eventually, over the course of nearly 100 years, that is what's happened, and we now live in this time zone country that we all know today. So when the sun rises in the east at Greenwich, it hits midday at noon, just right above our heads here at the observatory, and then sets in the west. This indicates our time that we're using at Greenwich. However, it takes 11 minutes for the sun to rise in the east at Bristol. 11 minutes later, noon occurs in Bristol, and 11 minutes after Greenwich, sunset occurs in Bristol. So there is a difference in time in the 18th century between Greenwich and Bristol, a difference of about 11 minutes. So this is felt east and west across the country. If you live on the same north-south line, there's no difference in time because the sun rises and sets at exactly the same time. So the difference is only apparent east and west. Now, this wasn't a problem back in the day when people travelled slowly or not very often, maybe on foot or by horse and cart, but it became more problematic when people required timetables, for example, the post office, or, of course, the railways. It was very difficult for the railway lines to deal with these differences in local times, and it would cause a huge amount of confusion for their timetables. So the railways would have to run to a certain timetable. So they'd have to indicate what time they are using. So in the 1830s, 1840s, you had a line running, for example, from London to Liverpool. Would they run to Liverpool time or would they run to London time? So this is confusing. So basically a railway had to specify which time they were using along their railway line. But it's also confusing because that means the time that the train is running to isn't necessarily the time at the station it's stopping in. So from the 1840s, there were growing calls to have a standardised time across the UK, often referred to as railway time, London time or Greenwich time. Initially, it's a bit confusing which time they actually mean, but it does very quickly just become Greenwich time. It should be the time that everyone is using because the astronomers here were so good at determining it accurately. There was a petition to Parliament, but it wasn't passed, and eventually the Railway Clearinghouse in 1847 orders all the railways to use London time or Greenwich time to run their timetables to. And the solution came with the telegraph lines and the wires, and as electricity was called back then, galvanism. They were able to connect clocks electrically through wires and send time signals. And thanks to the telegraph lines running along the railway lines, they were able to send these time signals directly to station clocks all around the country. So this is a very important timepiece. This was installed in 1852 by the Astronomer Royal George Airy. It was made by a clockmaker engineer named Charles Shepherd, and it allowed the observatory to send time signals throughout the United Kingdom via the telegraph lines. As the pendulum swung to and fro, it would close an electrical contact on each swing, allowing electrical current to pass. Connected by wires, this motor clock, or normal clock as it was known, would connect to sympathetic dials, which would all show exactly the same time. So of course, back in the time it was in use, not in a museum, these dials would not have been displayed right next to the clock. They would have been in other rooms throughout the observatory. And this clock was used throughout the observatory not only to send time signals to the railway stations, but also to show the different assistants working in different departments exactly what time it was without having to physically walk to the clock that was accurate. Telegraphy was hugely important for distributing time because these wires allowed the time signals to be sent from the Royal Observatory to stations, post offices, time balls, and anybody who required accurate time. And then from the 1850s, the railways start to use Greenwich Mean Time as they are physically connected via wires to the Shepherd motor clock, which is often known as the heart of the Greenwich time system. Part of the Shepherd sympathetic system was this clock known as the Shepherd Gate clock now. It showed the time for anyone who was willing to walk up the hill to get accurate time. But it would have been quite confusing. If you look closely, you'll see it's a 24-hour dial. So it displays the time 24 hours. You can see now it is about 10 to 10. But over 100 years ago, it would have been even more confusing because it would have been set to astronomical day, where the day began at noon and not midnight. For you and me living our daily lives, the day begins at midnight and runs to midnight, but for astronomers, the day ran from noon to noon. So this dial would have been even more confusing because noon would have been when both hands were right at the top indicating the zero. So the 24-hour clock is also what the astronomers used. So if you look around the observatory, you'll see many clocks with a 24-hour dial. The Shepherd Gate clock is a great example of a 24-hour dial. But in the case of a 24-hour dial or a 24-hour clock, there's no confusion of whether it's AM or PM. So no mistakes can be made that you think they mean PM when actually it's AM, and you don't turn up 12 hours after your train has departed. With the railways increasingly using Greenwich Mean Time, that meant that public clocks started showing Greenwich Mean Time too, to avoid confusion. And by 1855, I believe about 90% of clocks throughout the United Kingdom or throughout Great Britain were set to Greenwich Mean Time. Yes, there were some naysayers who didn't like the adoption of Greenwich Mean Time, particularly the further east or west you go of here, and but they called it railway aggression. But in the end, Greenwich Mean Time was declared legal time of Britain in 1880. So we use the sun to measure our day of 24 hours, and we also use clocks, but clocks are actually more accurate than the sun, or they became more accurate with advancing technology, which means although we regulate our day to the sun, what we're actually using is not solar time, as that would be called, which is what a sundial would show, but we are using Greenwich Mean Time, which is an average 24 hours based on the sun. And that's where the word mean comes from. It basically means average sun. And the word Greenwich comes from the fact that it's actually measured here at Greenwich. So Greenwich Mean Time was measured here at Greenwich, and this is slightly confusing because it actually wasn't measured by the sun, it was measured by the stars. Astronomers used what they call clock stars, and they measured exact time at which they transited across the north-south line, so an imaginary line running from north to south. One of these imaginary lines is now called the prime meridians. And basically they use the stars because they are far more accurate to measure than the sun, and it's quite easy to then translate this sidereal time, as it's called, or star time, into solar time, and from there you can calculate what your clock should be showing. So the relationship between railway time and GMT is GMT was used by the railways, and so maybe lots of people hadn't really heard of Greenwich Mean Time, but they had heard of railway time because that's what the railways were using in their hometowns. And it's not until a bit later that Greenwich Mean Time becomes more known by other people once it's used more widely and it becomes legal time. But basically railway time is the time that the railways were using, and that does become Greenwich Mean Time because they get their time directly from the Royal Observatory. This wonderful object, known as a railway traveller's watch, had 2 minute hands. So the idea was that a traveller could set 1 minute hand to show Greenwich time and the other minute hand to show the time at the place they were visiting. So for example, Bristol time. On the back of the case are engraved the times and the time difference between Greenwich and many other cities throughout the United Kingdom and Europe. The railways were very influential in standardising time. There had been calls before and people were attempting to standardise it, but with the delivery of the railway lines, the telegraph lines running alongside it, and the need becoming more pressing, it actually came into practice.